Hey everyone, this is Erin, and today I will be replicating this cool piece of concept art made by Eyvind Earle for Disney's 1959 Sleeping Beauty. I have lots of colors here today, but I'm starting with primary magenta, white, a small amount of black, and I'm also using just a tiny speck of true red. And starting off by activating my white acrylic gouache. So I want to mix up all the binder, the pigment, the chalk, all of those ingredients, make it nice and creamy and smooth before I start adding in a second color. And you can see I'm adding in black first, just a little bit at a time so that I can control this gray tone that I'm starting with. And I recently started doing this strategy where I begin with a gray tone. And a lot of Eyvind Earle's work has a slightly desaturated look to the colors that he used. So yeah, I'm just starting by creating gray. Depending on how much black I put in, it will be a lower value gray or a higher value gray if there's more white. And then I start to mix in the colors. So right now we're working on the background color as well as the peachy tone that it will gradiate into as it gets closer to the sun. So now I'm making this peach tone, starting with yellow and slowly adding in a little bit of the true red. So as always, you want to start with your lightest color, mixing in darker colors into that lighter color. It gives you a lot more control, a lot less risk of wasting paint. And yeah, you just do a little bit at a time until you reach the right value. And remember, value is how much white or black is put into a hue. So the hue is the color, and with more white you have a higher value hue, and with more black you have a lower value hue. We also call a white, when you add white, a tint, and when you add black it would be a shade. Okay, so here we go, starting with this little background section. It's just a small portion of the background, and you can see it's slightly watered down. You can see the white coming out from behind that, and that's okay. Once it dries, which it dries really quickly because it was quite watered down, I make or I add a second coat quickly with my flathead brush here. And while that second coat is still wet, so I'm working, this is sped up a little bit, but I'm working quickly here. And while that's still wet, I don't wash my brush off. I go into the peach color and I do this sort of swirly circular shape, which blends it nicely into the background, getting rid of crumbs as always. And yeah, just smoothing out the edge there of the glow coming from the sun. And then you can see that there's a little, almost like a dry brush effect happening there, which I don't want. So then I grab a tiny bit of that pink color that was the background, and I just blend out the edge there while everything is still wet. And I realized that the center of the sun was not bright enough. It really wasn't, it wasn't giving enough glow. So I go at it again here while everything is still wet, and I'm not pressing down too hard. So the pressure is light enough that I'm blending, but not so hard that I'm creating ridges in the paint. And now we're going to do the sun. Okay, so starting with white again, adding in yellow, primary yellow, and a tiny hint of the true red to make this more of a golden yellow, a little bit more of a leaning towards orange, or we could just say a warm yellow. And there's a lot of paint there, so I'm just going to twist some off my brush using what I call the squeegee method, and getting rid of that excess paint, and I can just sort of smooth out this little circle. And this time I'm pretty stoked with that circle. It worked out well. Okay, so I apologize. I lost a whole section of this video. It's been a really hectic week or two or three or four. So yeah, I lost that portion of the video, but the ground is orange mixed with gray, basically, is orange mixed with gray until you get that sort of clay color. And I'll put all the information in the description below, what colors I used. But now I'm just doing this also a background. So this is the sort of the foliage or the forest, but more the shadow of the forest. And using this color, which is ultramarine blue, a tiny bit of cyan, and gray. Again, I mixed the gray first and then slowly started to add in the blues. And I'm using the side of my flat brush, my flathead brush, to get the thicker section, and then I lighten up on the pressure and I sort of almost like a flick at the end there just to get a little bit of that dry brush, which I don't really succeed in at this point. It was better at the top there, that dry brush, but it still works. And this part of the painting actually reminds me, I read recently that one of the directors at Pixar, he said that he loved Eyvind Earle's backgrounds, that he made great choices with backgrounds, that he was able to really create a more identifiable foreground and background using lighting, using these streaks of light from the trees, the shadows, and it really creates this this separation between foreground, middle ground, and background. And so yeah, Pixar has sort of taken some cues from Eyvind Earle's ability to do that, to use light and shadow, yeah, to create these distinct areas of his work, of his scenes. All right, so next up, we're making a gray again, mixing it with some primary magenta. And this is the sort of shadowy tree color, I believe. Oh no, I'm doing the mountains. I'm doing the very distant hills here. So yeah, using that primary magenta so that we have a color that is somewhat similar, or at least it has a similar base as the sky, so that we are getting a sort of an atmospheric perspective effect happening. So having it made with primary magenta, it blends in really nicely. We can still make out those mountains and those hills, but it has a nice, yeah, a nice relationship to the sky behind it. Feels like it's way far off in the distance. And now we're going to add a little bit of this. What did we add? Oh, that's cyan. Putting in a little bit of cyan and adding more black. So this will stand out more because it has, because it is cooler. So we've added a cool blue to that warm, or to that cool red, to the magenta. And it makes this really lovely subtle gray. And then we can start putting in these trees, these sort of shadowed trees that feel like they're further in the distance. Yeah, so cool, Eyvind's trees. So what else? I was going to tell you something else about this project, about Sleeping Beauty. There's so much information about this movie because it was a huge project for Disney. The production went on for several years, and Disney was, determined to have all every scene stay true to the background art, which he hired Eyvind to be the sole artist to create the whole look of Sleeping Beauty. And there's a story about John Hench, a layout artist at Disney, who went to visit the Met Cloisters in Upper Manhattan. And when he came back, he had this idea that the style of the film should sort of imitate the medieval unicorn tapestries on display at the museum. And he said that they would fit perfectly with the cartoon medium. They have crisp edges, and that planes are not defined very well except by a kind of superimposition for distance rather than a linear perspective. So in other words, the style that we see Eyvind emulating here, or what he really sort of created in the process of doing all the backgrounds for Sleeping Beauty, is this very stylized, crisp way of drawing and painting landscapes in these layered, as I was mentioning before, this very distinct foreground, middle ground, and background. And then these shapes that are stylized, crisp, and almost tapestry-like. And so Hench went to Eyvind with this idea to use these tapestries and medieval art as inspiration. And so Eyvind took that idea and he said that he sort of changed it in a few areas. He said where Hench's trees were more curved, Eyvind decided to straighten them out and make things more linear, a little more crisp. And then during an early planning meeting with Walt Disney, Earle brought in these concepts, these paintings, and Walt looked at them and said, okay, that's it. Everyone's going to follow Eyvind. He was totally in love with Eyvind's paintings. And Sleeping Beauty was the first time that background paintings determined the direction of a Disney film. Yeah, which I think is pretty exciting, that Eyvind's translation of Hench's idea was so inspiring to Disney that, yeah, everyone else who worked on the film had to follow that concept. And it was not easy to do. It caused a lot of tension between the artists, but in the end, it really worked out. Okay, we've done some trees. Now we're going to do the hill that the castle is sitting on. So I've created a warm yellowy green color. And I'm just, really paying attention to the original piece of concept art, seeing the height of that hill, the shape of the hill, and smoothing out the gouache. And now we're going to add the highlights at the front. So it's just the same color with a little bit of white. And now we're going to make a darker version of the same color, adding a little bit of black. So we've just made a tint, and now we're making a shade. Just adding it over there on the right side. And this is, again, just adding to the sense of light and dark, the sense of shadow. And it also adds drama to a piece that, for the most part, is made up of high-value sort of pastel colors, which is a lovely contrast between the softness of the palette and then the more intense shadow and light aspect of the painting. It's incredible. I learned that Eyvind actually made hundreds of these paintings, like hundreds. He was concerned that his work might be simplified in the final product. So instead of creating sketches to hand over to the assistants, he created paintings, and hundreds of them. And they would actually all appear behind the animation cells that were made in the final film. And it was said that Earle was sometimes working on as many as 30 paintings at one time. It's just incredible. His dedication blows my mind. Speaking of dedication, as I'm painting in this little castle here, I taught this replicant in my recent Zoom course, and I had 5 students. I had 6 students in total. One of my students didn't really show up, but I shouldn't be saying that. Anyway, 5 students, and they all replicated this piece, which is amazing. And they did such an incredible job. So at the end of this video, if you stick around, you'll see I post three of their paintings. So 3 of the students submitted the paintings that they did. And it's so cool to see different people's takes on the same piece of concept art. And all 3 of them are really beautiful and have their own distinct feel to them. Okay, you can see it's a little bit textured there, and I find white is quite difficult. I think I'm learning with time, and after doing so many of these, that I should be maybe mixing in a bit more water with my white, and maybe a little more patience is needed as well. Doing several layers of more watered down white probably would help. But I love these little details in the gray, just these very simple little strokes to show windows and doors and the details, also the shadows on the castle. Very cute little castle. So I'm using a bigger brush here. I could have used a smaller brush. This happens a lot with me, is I just kind of go for it with the bigger brush. This is a number 6, but you can see this number 6 has a really nice point, fine point to it. And I always spin my brush so that it gets a really sharp point, and then I hold it incredibly close to the bristles. You can see there I'm like almost holding the brush itself, or the bristles. And yeah, it just gives me a lot more control. A nice fine tip. All right, next up we're putting in more shadows, mixing in a little bit of the ultramarine blue into that gray mixture. And this next set of shadows, testing it out there. I love the side there, all those paint swatches together. It's so beautiful to see Eyvind Earle's color palette all together like that. But yeah, these are just, well, they're not shadows necessarily. These are bushes that are in shadows, so silhouettes of bushes and trees and just some more rough details. And now we're going to do the shadowed trees on the left-hand side of the composition. So just testing it out here. This is the blue that I've been using for the background, just adding more black, a little bit of white and more of the blue. It turns out that this part ends up being a little too light, so I darken it up. I think I darken it up because it's strange, like gouache does dry, often dries darker or lighter depending on the pigment. And so sometimes it's hard to tell, but just doing these little dots, I love those dots that Eyvind did to represent the foliage and the light catching it. Just filling these out here. Yeah, it's so cool how it would just simple shapes to represent these bunches of trees. I was teaching a class last night and we were talking about how you can use simple shapes for pretty much anything. And, you know, if you ever want to go out and do a landscape and you're not really sure where to start, I would say like blur your eyes. If you wear glasses, take your glasses off, look at the scene in front of you as though it's just made up of shapes. Even a tree that's filled with leaves, like I'm looking at a tree right now at my window and it's covered in leaves, but the leaves are sort of in clumps, right? And you can actually create shapes of those clumps, like sort of, I guess like, you know, ovals or circular shapes to represent clumps of leaves. So that's a great strategy, is just breaking things down into shape. And you can see it worked really beautifully for Eyvind because this is basically a rounded square is the top of the trees and then these vertical lines for the trunks. And yeah, and it just looks pretty cool, and it's not very difficult to do. You'll notice that in order to get a straight line, I tend to do really small little strokes, and I'm resting my hand on my canvas so that it gives me a steadier hand, and then I start to do these little tiny strokes as I go down the picture plane. Gives me more control, a little bit of, yeah. It creates a little bit of a painterly effect, which is nice as well. Like that's not a perfectly straight trunk that is all the exact same width, and that's okay. A little variation is nice. And if you look at Eyvind's work, you can see that variation is in his work as well, although it's incredible to see just how precise a lot of his lines are. And the fact that he was painting 30 of these at a time, just, it's incredible. Okay, but I'm just doing one. I'm just doing one at a time, and I'm still finding this, you know, somewhat challenging. Okay, so just finishing off this last long skinny tree, and then I actually mix up a slightly darker version of this blue, and I do a second coat on all of them. And here we are, day 2, working on this painting, and I have some very strange lighting going on here. I actually moved where my desk was, so I'll be moving it back in a second. It'll get normal again, I promise. But I'm making the green, the low saturation, sort of pea green color. Some of us like to call it the exorcist green, if you know what I mean. And I'm mixing yellow in with a little bit of black and a tiny bit of cyan and some white. And as a lot of you may know, and as I've talked about before, some of the best greens are made using black and yellow. Black usually, most of the time, has a blue bias, which means that deep within that black color, there's a blue undertone, and you really see it when you mix it with yellow or with white. And so, yeah, most of the time when you create a gray with just black and white, you are getting a slightly cooler gray because it is more of a blue gray. Yeah, when you mix black and yellow together, you get this really lovely, more of a natural green. And then in this case, I did want to have a little bit of a boost, so I put in some of that cyan, which is the cool blue. And now we're doing the carriage, and yellow is a tough one. So yellow and black mixed together to make this green. We still have that yellow pigment which we're contending with, and yellow pigment is very transparent. It doesn't smooth out the same way other pigments smooth out when you add water. I just find it to be quite challenging to paint with. So you can see here it's pretty goopy. And yeah, I guess my recommendation would be to do a thinner coat with more water and do several thinner coats that have more water mixed in so that it's extra smooth. And the same is with the white that I was talking about earlier. And yeah, I was using paint that was slightly thicker than it should have been, so you can see that it's textured there and not as smooth as it should be. All right, so now we're going to create the color that's on the top of the carriage. So it has this sort of golden color, like an orangey gold color. So I'm using the green mixture that I had with some True Red, and this is really warming it up. And it's a good idea, if you can, to use colors that you've already mixed to create a new color, and that way you do have this sort of cohesion throughout the whole piece that's really lovely. So if you can, use a color that's already been pre-mixed to start a new color. So I use that green, I'm adding some of the True Red, white, and primary yellow, and it's giving me this sort of a, I'm going to call it camel hair. Let's name this color camel hair. We could also say it's sort of a caramel color as well. And that's the top of the carriage. And I'm just sussing out where everything is. Like I do that usually before I start to paint because I'm not drawing anything. I kind of draw it out with the end of my paintbrush, making sure I don't get any paint on the canvas when I'm doing that, but just sort of figuring out where things are going to sit. And I don't always get it right. I definitely mess up my positioning sometimes, but generally things are in sort of the right place. I also test out colors. You'll notice that when I'm doing the swatch test, I test it out on top of the color that I'm actually layering on top of in the composition. So this camel hair color is on top of that shadowy blue in behind. So when I test out the swatch, I do it on top of the shadowy blue swatch so that I can see what it'll look like, right? Because colors, they do change depending on what color they are placed on top of. Not only visually do they change, like our brains see colors differently depending on the context, depending on what color they're beside, but also when you're painting over top of colors, that color will come through a little bit unless you do many, many coats. So it's nice to sort of see what you'll end up getting. And now we're doing these gold flourishes, and I'm trying to use the shape of my paintbrush for this. I'm trying not to draw out the shape, but actually allow the shape of the brush to dictate the shape of this flourish. And you'll see again that yellow is tough to work with. I will be doing a few coats. Adding white always helps too. Adding white gives yellow more body, but it is still tough to get a nice smooth texture with yellow. Just doing these little highlights on the carriage. These shapes are so fun, the shapes of the carriage and of the little people sitting on the carriage. The whole thing is extremely charming. And the colors are just, they're so yummy. The pinks that come in soon and the reds, oh my gosh. All right, so using the same camel hair, golden camel hair, that's what I'm calling it. We're using that same color for the wheels here, for the undercarriage. What color is your undercarriage? And the pink. So this peachy pinky color that is going to be the upper half of the, what do we call them? Footmen? Are they the footmen? Who drives the carriage? We've talked about this before. I've gone through this in other videos. Horsemen? I don't know. Please tell me, somebody. But anyway, this sort of candy pink color. And this is just such a lovely example of like really simple shapes making up a body. You know, you don't have to be great at anatomy to create a fun illustration that has a lot of character and movement. So this very simple shape for the arm, this sort of rounded triangle for their little cute bodies. And there we go. We know what's going on. Although they both kind of look like elephants right now, like little pink elephants. But we'll put some pants on them and they will turn into footmen / horsemen, carriage drivers. I don't know. They turn into people, not elephants. Little pants, little red pants, adorable. And a little butt. I love their little butts too. I think I tried to give this guy a bit more of a booty. Little ham hock of a leg there. Oh yeah, that guy, I was like, you need more booty. There you go. Yeah, that red and pink together, so hot. And just adding a tiny bit of yellow to the red because it wasn't tomato soupy enough, you know? I got to get my favorite color in there. And yeah, a little crumb in my soup. Someone was eating crackers. Okay. And now we're going to, I think we're painting the trumpets, the little trumpets that they're blowing as they announce the arrival of, who do you think they're announcing the arrival of? What is this scene? I don't know. I think, let's say it's the arrival of the princess? I don't know. It's somebody showing up to something. And these little horns, so cute. And again, placement is really about, at this point, looking at what's behind it. Like how far across does the horn go over the trunk of the tree behind it? And this is important because you don't want to create tension. So even if it's not exactly like the original piece, I always think about tension. So I don't want those horns to like stop right where the trunk is. I want them to cut across it, if that makes sense, just to limit the tension. And these little tiny black hands and feet and heads, which just creates such a nice contrast, you know, beautiful contrast here. This color palette is just gorgeous, and it really stands out against that sort of more diminished, desaturated, higher value background. And then these black details just totally bring it all together as usual, you know, adding the black at the end. We're just like, oh, it looks so good. It makes something that otherwise looks a little unfinished and rough, just gives it that detail. And here we go with the horsies. Whenever I paint horses, I always think about a joke that my friends and I have where, what movie is it from? Oh shoot. It's from a stoner movie where at one point he's like, I love horses. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? What is that movie? What is it? There's like a part in it with a horse. I think he gets stoned with a horse, or he punches out a horse. I don't know. Someone, please help me. And now I feel like I should look it up, but I'm not going to. I'm going to talk about painting horses. Another example of just really focusing on shape and not even thinking about these shapes as horses, because then you get caught up, or at least I get all hung up on what I think it should look like. So I'm just strictly copying what I see as closely as possible, allowing my brush to really, create these strokes, these gestures, and going quickly. I tend to go faster when it's a part of the painting that I'm scared to do. I kind of like, I just wanted to get it over with. So putting these in here, I think it turned out okay. I was actually really impressed. My students in the Zoom course painted the horses, I think, far better than I did. You'll see again, as I mentioned earlier, you'll see it at the end of the video here. And last but not least, we're putting on, oh, this isn't the last step. The last step are the reins, the red reins, but I forgot to do the flag here. So just adding that in. And yeah, this color is quite subtle. It's white, but it has a tiny bit of cyan, I believe, just to give it a little bit of coolness against that warm blue in the background, so it really stands out. A little bit of motion there. And then we're going to continue making this sort of tomato soup red to do the reins. And just going for it. These are so fun, these gestural strokes that are very quick, active, exciting strokes. We love those. Okay, who doesn't love an exciting stroke? Horsies, that horse looks more like a greyhound. Okay, and this is the last step. Yay, is the tree in the foreground. I forgot all the silhouetted trees in the very foreground. One of my favorite things that Eyvind Earle did was, and same with Mary Blair, I mean, they knew how to create so much depth by creating silhouetted elements in the foreground, in front of everything else. So these are the last step of the painting, of course, because they overlap, they overlap elements behind them. And yeah, just gives just yet another layer. So we've got, in this case, we've got like a foreground, a middle ground, a background, and then a far background. I don't even know what you'd call that, distant background. And then we have mountains way behind that are in that sort of pinky gray color, so that creates atmospheric perspective. And it's just, yeah, it's like layers and layers. And all of those layers are really accentuated through the use of light and shadow. And these silhouetted plants just, yeah, starting it all off, ending it all off. It's confusing. Anyway, last thing that you do is the first thing that you really see, I guess. Or it's the closest thing to the viewer. Yeah, something like that. And yeah, lovely little foliage here, quick and easy to paint. Drawing out the shape first and then filling it out is one technique, or you can just use the shape of your brush to create those leaves, whatever works for you. And we're about to wrap it up. So next video in 2 weeks from now, I'm putting out videos every 2 weeks. Starting in October, I'll be doing one a week. That's my goal. But in 2 weeks from now, I will be doing a request, which I'm stoked about, to do something different. And so if you have any requests, let me know. Here's mine all finished up, but let's take a look at some of my students' pieces. So this is Jillian's, absolutely gorgeous, love that sky. And this is Nico's, and I thought Nico's horses were superb. Actually, his whole piece is just gorgeous, and Julian with the most beautiful gradient. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. See you again soon.